Well, all right, ninth grade bio. This is where we start. Normally, if I had you in class, you would see my face, watch me move, hear my voice, interrupt me with questions. We'd have a little back and forth. I'd show you some cool images, and this would be kind of our foundation, our start to the year. And you would get a feel for me, the subject, the science, and kind of what I expect from you. So for now, you are going to listen to these mini lectures on your own. We'll try and package it so that you can listen to them during your actual class time. Um, and then be prepared to discuss with me the next day in class elements of this lecture. So take good notes. There are things embedded throughout. Pay attention. Pretend that you are in class in a desk listening to me and that you need to know this stuff so that we can talk right in my science class. And this, like I said, is our beginning right here. So this is week one, where we are going to discuss the what of biology, meaning what is it, what does it focus on, where did it come from, why is it the way that it is. And that has everything to do with its history and philosophy as a very particular science. And so, let's try this out for a couple weeks where you listen to these and then prepare for discussion during the next day. And on that next day, we'll talk about this. We'll talk about your book. We'll answer some section questions together, and we'll just get you off on the right foot. Okay? So, where I would start you off with is with these guys, the physiologoi, the nature studiers. They're nature philosophers. They're pre Socratics, meaning they're way back. And they sought to understand the nature of life, or they studied living organisms, or how nature works, quote unquote, in order to live wisely. And so I want to be clear, these aren't necessarily the first scientists, these are natural philosophers, and they want to know how to live wisely. Um, I'm using that word wisdom because there's a big division, a big gulf, a big difference between intelligence and wisdom. A way to define intelligence is that maybe you know how to respond quickly, or you can remember things, or you can process, in a certain way. Information, data, connections, concepts, precepts, these types of things. But that is a big difference between that and being wise. Someone can be intelligent, but not a good person. They can process things really quickly, but that doesn't mean they're a wise individual. They might have a great memory, but they could be a real jerk. And so the difference between being intelligent and wise is really, really different, and is really, really big. And so my point is, these were not just people that were not just going out to study nature for its own sake. They were trying to figure out morals, the good life, what matters, philosophy. So I get the intent, and I don't think it's bad necessarily. I agree sometimes we need to get away from people and get out of the city, get back to nature, if you will, to maybe increase gratitude, calm our souls down, clear our minds, and nature has much to teach us. But we have to be careful about saying that's not natural, or using nature as an example. And some examples for you are this: if we just pick some common creatures from the natural world and see if they would serve us well, for examples of how to live rightly. So let's think of a lion pride. You've got one guy, he's got gorgeous hair. He doesn't really do any of the hunting. He has a lot of women. They do all the hunting and raising the cubs. If you know what happens when one male lion takes over the pride of another male lion, do you know the first thing that they do? They kill the cubs. They kill the cubs in order, I guess, to pass on their DNA is the way to say it, but so that the females will stop caring for the cubs. They'll go back into heat, and he can mate with them and pass on his own DNA. So that really kind of changes the whole perspective on Lion King or King Aslan or something like that. I don't know. But lions might not be the best example for us. Think of ants. You've got one woman, and all she does is spit out babies, and she's got a lot of half male drone slaves who build the house and maintain it and feed her only so that she can have more babies. That's an odd setup. And there are fish, like the koi fish, that they don't really change sexes or genders, but the male, if he gets suspicious or gets alerted that another male wants his female, then he will change his coloration and behavior to act like a female so that that male will be attracted to him and not her. Now, I got to tell you, if I go out on a date with my wife and some weird guy is wanting to hit on my wife or is attracted to her, I am not going to dress up like a woman to tempt her away. Those are really odd thoughts and odd examples. And so nature isn't always the best example of how we should live rightly or morally or the good life or anything like that. But that was the attempt. The physiologoi were Greek pre Socratic philosophers trying to get lessons out of nature to make moral decisions about right versus wrong, but they were the first to go out and see what they could understand. One of the most popular ones, as you can tell, we've advanced the dates here. We're now in the AD, is Pliny or Pliny, depending on if you're from Texas, how you want to say his name. But Pliny the Elder, he wrote a textbook called Natural History. Now, I say textbook because there were books around during this time, but this was a textbook, meaning it was meant for younger minds. A textbook, like what you have for this class, is not just a regular book. It's a book written by hopefully experts, people who are experienced and smart in the field. They know what they're talking about, and they write it in such a way, they package it in such a way as to give it to minds who don't know anything about that subject. And so it's a way of transmission and a way of communicating. And so Pliny wrote this book called Natural History, and it's got everything in it that he could get in it: astronomy, geography, zoology, botany, mineralogy, anthropology, I mean, about humans. And so he put everything in there that he could. So we either love this guy or hate this guy. You know, he's the first guy to make a textbook for us to write things down. So here's an example of Pliny's work for those of you that are savvy in Latin and you can actually maybe see the screen or the image really well. You can read some of this. It's in Latin. By the way, all the images that you're seeing come to us courtesy of the University of Oklahoma History of Science Collections. I got my master's degree there, if you remember. And so while I was there, I have a terabyte of high-res images that I took pictures of all these works in their studio because I was strategizing about being an educator. And so this is the actual work that we took a picture of. And so it's gorgeous. I mean, if you're a doodler, if you like to draw in the margins, this is your guy. So you are absolutely allowed to doodle and to draw. Just don't put weird things in there like I love Trevor forever or nothing like that I would see. But I don't mind doodling, just kind of keep it under control. But actually, this is not just doodling, this is art. And so one of the things that these writers believed in, here's another example of Pliny's work, is that truth must be couched in beauty. And so they had no cell phone, no TV. I don't think he had a girlfriend, so he had plenty of time. And so they would do this magnificent artwork around the content of the natural science. I asked a student one year what they thought of this, and this girl responded that she saw this as a giant waste of time. And so my pushback for that was, well, how do you waste your time? What do you do? And the answer was what you might expect: social media, kitty cat videos, stuff like that. So anyway, here's your daily dose of Pliny. I think it's absolutely beautiful. And by the way, we'll talk about it later. If we get into Sci-Fair, talk about Sci-Art, I've had students who wanted to replicate Pliny's work, just a page of content, maybe written in Latin with calligraphy, and then do all this beautiful artwork around it. I've got some examples of that in my classroom, which you'll see. Really impressive, really cool, not a waste of time. Wonderful. So as we move forward, a fun question that we'll discuss tomorrow is, what would school be like if it were held in a museum? How would it be different if we held school in a museum? Museums have their own history, and here's some drawings, some examples and dates of some of these early museums. They started off as collections of natural phenomena, natural artifacts, and they were mostly held by aristocrats, by the rich. And so you can look through these images and see things in jars, on shelves, things thrown up on the ceiling. There's a porcupine on the top left. I think that was probably pretty easy to throw up there, just kind of give it a good shove and maybe it'll stick to the ceiling. But some of your rooms look like this. You've got stuff on your walls and on shelves. And so this was kind of a show off room by the rich. Here's another one. Apparently, there's a polar bear up there. And what kind of a weirdo puts deer antlers on the wall? That's kind of strange. I'm just kidding. Welcome to Texas. Actually, it's a German phenomenon started off. And then, of course, you see that tiny little person, I guess, stuck in the corner of a shelf. I don't know if that's a hobbit or what is that. But anyway, you can see that these started off as collections of natural artifacts. Here's another one with a big alligator up top, and I guess these guys wearing pantaloons or pantyhose with weird shorts and helmets. But this was meant for the rich, and they have their cabinets full of small artifacts and books and birds. And so you can look around here. I guess those are pocket dogs on the bottom left. But this is where they would have their parties. This is where they would show off their conquests and their travels. And this is the history of museums. And if you think about museums today, they are very much not just a warehouse or a classroom. They're a gallery walk. If you think about the Perot, there's a pathway you are definitely supposed to follow as you go up and down and all around. And it's a gallery, basically. And so if you look at this image, again, another collection, and again, another small person. I guess that's where all the hobbits went. But if you look at the top, along the top part of the wall, you should be able to notice some weapons. Right or wrong, good or bad, fortunate or unfortunate, early science followed military conquests of Western Europe. So the military would go in and wipe out these areas and plunder and pillage and take stuff. And the scientists basically, they weren't called that then, but the scientists basically would follow these people and collect shells and plants and animals and examples and rocks and fossils and you name it of these new territories. And what that means for you is that by the time you get to the 1600s, Europe is going to be thrown into a crisis of mind. They're going to start noticing that in areas that have the same environment, they have different organisms. And when certain organisms that live in one place don't live in another. And conversely, you'll have organisms that are very, very similar, if not identical, living in two different places that are distantly, related. And so they're going to start asking questions of like, what are you and why are you here and why are you not here? And so this is going to create a real crisis where they see similar rocks, different plants, similar birds, you name it, and they now have to figure things out. There are more questions than answers, and the goal of, and you can tell where this is going to go, the goal of biology is to figure out the story of life. It is not uniform and it is not the same through time nor all the way around the planet. There are differences, there are changes, and there is a story there to be told. And that's what begins to come up with these collections as people start to compare and travel to different places. It got so bad that one guy named Frederick Reusch did some very strange things with these artifacts. He put them in jars. This makes no sense. I won't show you what he did with baby skeletons. Yeah, that's disturbing. But he kind of did a very bad frog and toad episode where he would put coral and shells and frogs and snakes. This is a crisis of the mind. I don't know what to do with these things. I don't know how they're related. And so it's almost like a cry for help that he makes this quote-unquote artwork and preserves these creatures, but there is no systematic way that he's organizing any of this to make sense of it. So if we advance the cause here a little bit, it gets worse as the technology gets better. And if you want to remember anything important here as we get into the history of biology, it is this book, The Micrographia. We'll come back to this when we do cell theory. written by Robert Hooke. And make sure you spell Hooke correctly, Hooke. He's a Brit. They use too many letters. And so anyway, he wrote this book called the Micrographia, or the small writings, basically, and physical descriptions of minute bodies using magnifying glasses and observations with and inquiries. And so point is, he wants to look at tiny things. So with museums, they looked at things in different places and found out they were different, not what they expected. And with Robert Hooke, they look at tiny things and realize they're not what they expected. And do you know what this famous image is? You should be saying cork. And so it's the cork, it's the underlayer underneath the bark of a tree, basically. And he looks at this and he sees these little squares and holes and circles. And Robert Hooke was an ordained minister, and he sees these little things and he says they look like rooms, but they didn't use a room, that word, back then. They used the word cell, like a monk's cell. We refer to that as like a jail cell, but that's kind of negative. So we're talking about a monk cell, a monk's room, a dorm room, basically. And so he looked at living creatures close up and realized they're all composed of tiny rooms or cells. So that's where cell theory came from, but we'll talk about that later. But the observations continue. The more they peer into life, the more complex and intricate it is. It's not getting simpler, it's getting more complicated, and that is really confusing for them. And I'd say that's the case even still today in genetics and in evolution. The more they peer into life and try to understand how it works, the more complex and intricate it becomes. It goes the reverse of all the other sciences. All the other sciences like physics and chemistry, you can kind of, the more you zoom in, it becomes more fundamental, more simple. Life works the opposite. The more you zoom in, it frankly gets more complicated. And so you'll experience that this year with our units. The more we zoom in, the closer we get, it gets more intricate, more sophisticated, and more complicated. So hang on. By the way, this is a picture of a flea. I don't know if you know your history well enough, but can you imagine why a Western European would be interested in a flea? If you're thinking of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, it later became found out that it was spread by fleas on rats that were embedded in cargo on the silk trade routes. And so Robert Hooke was an ordained minister and basically praised God for the complex little creature that brought such devastation that no one could see. And he felt like he was peering into the mind of God by zooming in on a flea. Almost done here, a couple more images. This is his entry of an ant, and you can't really see the text, but it's that bottom paragraph, and it says, I took to delineate and put it into a drop of very well rectified spirit of wine. So basically he's drinking during lab. We're not going to be doing that. That's not allowed. But he couldn't see the ant really well, so he put his pinky, I imagine, into the wine, dropped it on the ant, stained it a little bit. And if you look at this ant figure, it's not just a picture of an ant. By the way, these aren't pictures. They're all hand-drawn, so how's your artistry? But if you look at this page of the ant, it's got schema 38, I can't see on the image there, and it's got the A, B, C, D all the way around it. Robert Hooke was the first one to start labeling these images, and then you have that tradition in your textbook now. You'll see figure 2.1, figure 13.3, stuff like that, that's labeled, and so he's the one that begins this tradition. Admire his artwork here and how clever he is. In order to study a fly and how a fly flies, you put the fly on the wing of a fly to study the wings. And maybe someday when you're in class, and I can zoom in on these, the detail, you would probably call it like the pixelation, the resolution, the refinement of these images is absolutely astounding. The wing that you're looking at, that big wing, it's not shaded. It actually has little squares in it to create the grid pattern, and it is unbelievable. For my art people in class, you should admire Robert Hooke. It's very, very cool, and I talked to Dr. Rice about what he might have used as a medium, and we think it was probably a pen, so no mistakes. So just marvel at the creativity and artistry of scientists, and Robert Hooke is one of my favorite people. Well, as we end, I want you to write these questions down in your notes. This is our last slide. I'll leave it right here. And we will talk about these during our discussion time. So write these down, and part of your homework, or your prep, I should say, for discussion time tomorrow is science is a what activity? Give me some adjectives, any of them. Shallow, deep, doesn't matter. Just give me whatever adjectives you want. We'll talk about it. True or false? There's only one scientific method. I'd love to know what you learned. I will teach you what William Whewell means to us in the history of science. And these last two are kind of open-ended questions. What are some characteristics of science, meaning what distinguishes it from your Latin class or history class or PE? What are we doing in this class? I mean, we have desks and books and pens and all that kind of stuff, but we should be doing something that separates this subject from your other subjects. Can you tell me what that is? Last, this is a fun one. It's kind of a debate, open question, which you'll enjoy. What does a person have to believe to study the world, the natural world? I don't mean like, I mean, you can say it if you want. I mean, I'm not like Jesus or anything like that. I'm saying, what are some basic assumptions that you have to have in place to then step out and study the natural world? That is going to be a fun discussion. Okay? So write these questions down in your notes, have them prepped, have them ready. When we're back together, I will be doing note checks, and we will catch up on some of these daily grades. So you need to trust me and believe me. Don't slack off. Don't slow down. Don't back off or anything like that. Start off right. Take good notes. And then when we're all back together, I can easily catch up on grades or get snapshots of some of your work. So any work that you do, you'll always get points. So have these questions ready to go so that when I call on you, you've got something to say.